Having proven themselves faithful during the War of Wrath, the Edain were rewarded by the Valar with a new land to dwell in, far removed from the dangers of Middle-earth. Thus, Ulmo raised an island halfway between Middle-earth and Aman that became known henceforth as Numenor. The Numenorians would represent the very pinnacle of men, and at the height of their glory would create a maritime empire across the coast of Middle-earth. Upon seeing the masts of Numenorian warships, all those under the shadow of their enemies would tremble and flee. Their military splendor and might even brought the Dark Lord Sauron to his knees. The Numenorian Empire would be uncontested until their pride and arrogance became their downfall. Welcome to our latest video on the armies of Middle-earth, where we will discuss how the men of lost Numenor did battle with their enemies. The Edain were guided to Numenor by the Star of Eärendil, but were forbidden from sailing west out of sight of its shores or from setting foot upon the Undying Lands. Because Numenor was within sight of Tol Eressëa, the Numenorians who dwelt on the island were given a longer span of life, thrice that of lesser men. Indeed, Numenorians understood the gift of Ilúvatar, and were blessed in that they did not share the same fear of death that lesser men held. The first ships arrived at Numenor in SA 32, with Elros, son of Eärendil, becoming the first king of Numenor, taking the name Tar Minieto. Over the next 50 years, the majority of the Edain migrated to Numenor alongside Druidine refugees. The Edain brought with them the most knowledgeable in arts and crafts amongst the houses of men, many of whom had learned under the elves. Moreover, many elves, such as those of Tol Eressëa, often visited the men of Numenor, bringing them gifts and sharing their knowledge. Because of this, the Numenorians became extremely skilled in arts and crafts, forging armor and weapons that were uncontested in Arda, save by the Valar. They developed advanced ironsmithing techniques, producing weapons that were rust-proof and strong enough to penetrate troll hides. Soon a guild of weaponsmiths emerged, founded by those of great knowledge and skill, many of whom learned under the Noldor in the forging of swords, spears, axes, bows, knives, and other weaponry. In addition to craftsmanship, the Numenorians were cunning in the mining, smelting, and forging of lead, copper, iron, and steelcraft. They crafted spell-wrapped swords, such as the blades of the Barrow Down, and perhaps imbued spells into their indomitable masonry, as seen in works like Orthanc or the Walls of Minas Tirith. Many noble Numenorians also inherited legendary crafts, such as the Ring of Barahir, Axe of Tuor, Bow of Bregor, and the swords Aranruth and Narsil. Alongside a longer lifespan, the Numenorians would become much taller than lesser men, and would know no sickness until the shadow fell upon them. The initial fleet of Elros, which consisted of roughly 150 ships, brought 5,000 to 10,000 Edain to the island. Over the 50-year migration period, perhaps 200 to 350,000 Edain migrated to Numenor. Considering the colonies founded later on in the 1,000-year history of the nation, the Numenorian population could have reached a peak of 15 million. While Tolkien did not give precise details of the Numenorian military structure, one can make educated guesses. We do know that at the top echelon was the King of Numenor, a title held by 25 rulers, 3 of whom were queens. From the Elros Tar Minieto to the time of Ar-Pharazôn, the kings of the Isle held the scepter of Numenor, thus controlling its military. Underneath the king were noble families, many of whom likely held significant positions within the military hierarchy. The second largest noble family to that of Elros were the Lords of Andúnii, who ruled over the shoreland region of Andustar and held the scepter of Annúminas. The king held the power of decision over the affairs of the state. However, there was an advisory body, the Council of the Scepter, or King's Council, consisting of the heir of the king and lords from the 6 regions of Numenor: Forastar, Andustar, Hjarnastar, Harrowstar, Orostar, and Mittelmar. The Lords of Andúnii were the most prominent among the Council of the Scepter. These councillors could have held positions equivalent to military chiefs of staff, such as generals and admirals, and been charged with overseeing strategic decisions at the highest levels. We know of Admiral Kyato, who was the commander of the Numenorian fleet sent by Tar Minastir to aid Gil-galad during the War of Elves and Sauron in SA 1700. There was also Great Captain Eldarion, who founded the Uinendili, or Guild of Ventures, a brotherhood of mariners and seamen. Lesser nobles and common Numenorians who rose through the military ranks often became officers, responsible for leading units at various levels. The backbone of the Numenorian military was the infantry marine, as Numenor was a maritime power, whose sphere of power was exerted along Middle-earth's coast. There were also specialized archer units, support units, and an auxiliary cavalry force. The Numenorian means of communication were maritime-based, but as the shadow fell upon Numenor, the Eldar bestowed the Numenorians with Amandil and Palantiri stones that could communicate with one another across vast distances. One stone remained at the Tower of Avaloni, while Elendil would distribute 7 Palantiri across Middle-earth after the downfall of Numenor, allowing the later realms in exile to benefit from superior lines of communication against their enemy Sauron. Since all of Numenor's battles would be amphibious in nature, their soldiers acted as both marine and infantry when they marched upon Mordor. The Numenorian infantry marine was something akin to the superhuman Gurkha soldier of our world. They went to battle fully equipped, bearing heavy armor, weapons, supplies, and provisions. Each carried a sealed wallet on his left belt, a small vial of cordial, and wafers of whey bread that could sustain them for many days. These rations were heavily influenced by the lembas bread of the elves. With all of this, they could march 8 leagues per day with ease, taking short breaks at the end of each league and an hour break near midday. If necessary, they could push to 12 leagues a day, the equivalent of 24 to 36 miles a day. Numenorian infantry marines wore a helmet called kama, wrought of overlapping plates of metal, covered with a crest of embossed and dyed leather, giving the appearance of a fish. We have no details about Numenorian armor other than it being heavy, but given the Atlantean themes of Tolkien's Numenor, one could guess it was quite nautical, perhaps with a Mediterranean flair. The artist Turner Mohan drew a series of designs on early to late Second Age Numenorian armor, utilizing the Kama's design for inspiration. The Numenorians' cleverly wrought and magnificently decorated equipment held heavy influence from the Noldor. In terms of weaponry, the infantry marines wielded swords, axes, spears, daggers, and bows. Their weaponry was light, strong, and seemed untouched by time, never rusting and glittering in the sun. The infantry marines' main weapons during war were spears, swords, and shields, as a result of their incredible height. It is said that they towered above the tallest orcs, and their swords and spears far outreached the weapons of their enemies. For close-range combat, they girded themselves with a short sword, called an eket, worn as a sidearm, described as a stabbing sword with a broad blade, pointed and two-edged, from a foot to 1.5 feet long. This type of sword could be something akin to the ancient Roman gladius. The infantry marines fought in phalanxes, and when on the defense, used a formation known as the Thangale, forming 2 closely pressed ranks, presenting a barrier of shields. The Thangale was designed to be flexible so that it could bend at one or both of its ends to prevent flanking maneuvers, and even curl around to meet itself and form an unbroken circle of shields. This formation is similar to the Scottish Sheltron, ancient Greek phalanx, and ancient Roman testudo. The Numenorian marines also used an offensive formation known as the Dunnaith. This was a wedge formation launched over a short distance against an enemy massing but not yet arranged. It was designed for rapid attacks to disorganize the enemy and relied on the Numenorians' superior size and strength. While the Numenorians overwhelmed their enemies with their size and strength in close quarters, it was actually from a distance that they were most feared. Indeed, the Numenorians had a specialized ranged unit, known as the King's Archers, whose cohorts bore bows crafted from hollow steel that fired 4-foot-long black-feathered arrows. The bows of the Numenorians were greatly feared, for it was said that the men of the sea sent before them a great cloud as a rain turned to serpents, or a black hail tipped with steel. Numenorian men, being tall and powerful, were capable of shooting with speed and accuracy, using great longbows, whose shafts could carry to a great distance, some 600 yards, and at lesser range were of great penetration. The Numenorians' chief sport was horseback archery, which they designed smaller bows for. While Numenorians rarely performed as cavalry themselves, they did use auxiliaries drawn from the middle men of the continent for the task, who they perhaps armed and trained in Numenorian ways. Despite the Númenóreans' aversion to cavalry fighting, Numenor did possess horses. Indeed, Númenorian men and women both rode and bred horses, honouring them and housing them nobly. They trained horses to hear and answer their calls from great distances, and it was believed some could even summon them by need of a thought alone. Númenorians made longbows and smaller bows for shooting from horseback. They also devised crossbows, which at first were used mainly against predatory birds. However, the horses of Numenor were never used for war, as Númenorian wars were all fought overseas and transporting horses by boat was logistically challenging. The great stature and strength of Númenorians allowed them to be fully equipped on a foot march. Only within their offshore settlements in Middle-earth, where they acquired and bred horses on the mainland, were they used by couriers and bodies of light-armed archers, often not of the Númenorian race. Thus, the Númenorian cavalry was an auxiliary force, consisting mostly of lesser men. By far the most defining feature of Numenor was her great navy, which allowed her to colonize the coast of Middle-earth. Númenorian ships were known to have up to 5 masts, equivalent to schooners, that could carry anywhere between 500 to 1,000 personnel. The ships were powered by both sails and oars, and some would be rowed by slaves after Numenor fell under the shadow. In early notes, Tolkien stated of the Númenorian navy that ships go now without the wind, and many are made of metal that sheareth hidden rocks, and they sink not in calm or storm, but they are no longer fair to look upon. While it seems unlikely that Numenor had any steamships, perhaps they ironclad their sail ships. Many high-ranking sea captains arose throughout Numenor's history, such as the great navigator Vientur, who was the first Númenorian to make the sea voyage back to Middle-earth aboard his flagship Entellesi. His daughter Almarion was taken in marriage by the king's heir Tar-Meneldur, who became the Queen of Numenor. Her son Aldarion became known as the Great Captain, who in SA 750 founded the Uinendili. Aldarion voyaged east across the Great Sea to explore the coast of Middle-earth, visiting Gil-galad in Lindon. Along the coast, Númenorians came into contact with lesser men, to whom they taught crafts, traded, and established friendly relations. During his voyages, Aldarion founded the harbour of Vinjalondi at the mouth of the Gwathlo, the first Númenorian settlement in Middle-earth. Here the Uinendili harvested local timber for shipbuilding. After a few centuries of the deforestation of the Enedwaith and Minhiraeth, the Númenorians angered the local native population, leading to conflict. The lesser men were pushed further east, into the dark woods of the great Cape of Erin Vorn. To exploit this discontent, Sauron burnt nearly all that remained of Enedwaith and Minhiraeth. This prompted the Númenorians, after SA 1200, to find and build permanent havens elsewhere along the coast of Middle-earth, such as Peligir and Umbar. In SA 1695, Kiatur, the commander of the Númenorian fleet, transported the great host of Minas Tirith to aid Gil-galad during the War of Elves and Sauron. Kiatur arrived just in time to prevent the fall of Lindon, with the Númenorian army pushing Sauron's forces back to Sand-Ford. A great slaughter of Sauron's forces took place there, forcing them to withdraw further to Gwathlo, where they linked up with other forces from Tharbad. However, a Númenorian army had landed at Sauron's rear at Vinjalondi, crushing the Dark Lord's army. Sauron was routed utterly and assailed all the way to eastern Calanathan. With no more than his bodyguard remaining, Sauron fled for Mordor. In SA 1800, the shadow fell upon Numenor. They became proud, discontented, and irritated by the ban of the Valar, forgetting the meaning of the gift of Ilúvatar. A civil war loomed between the king's men and the faithful, such as the lords of Andúnir. The faithful sought refuge in colonies such as Peligir, which was heavily fortified in SA 2350. A noble family of faithful would also settle in the Bay of Belfalas, building a stronghold on the promontory. The king's men now sought to dominate the coast of Middle-earth, demanding tribute from the lesser men they once had friendly relations with. A massive maritime empire emerged. In SA 2280, Umbar was heavily fortified, and colonists increased as the Númenorians began to dominate the Harad. Consequently, Sauron retreated from the lands of Harad in terror. The Númenorian fortifications and that of their descendants in the Realms of Exile were some of the most formidable structures to grace Middle-earth. Initially, the Numenorians built fortifications to defend their colonial holdings, but this gradually turned to suppressing local populations, and then to defend against the forces of Sauron. Orthanc could even withstand Ents hurling themselves at it, who could not get a grip on it nor make a crack in it, bruising themselves as they tried. The city of Minas Tirith was unconquerable by steel or fire, unbreakable except by the force of earthquakes. Minas Anor, Minas Ithil, Fornost, and Anúminas all withstood incredible attacks from Sauron in the Third Age, proving Numenor's engineering might. Much like the ancient Romans, the Numenorians understood the value of fortification, not only as a means of defense, but also offensively. After returning to power, Sauron began attacking Numenorian coastal settlements and took the title King of Men and Lord of the Earth. King Ar-Pharazôn the Golden heard rumors of these tidings, and that Sauron wished to destroy Numenor. Outraged, Ar-Pharazôn elected to claim the title King of Men, and forced Sauron to be his servant. For 5 years, Ar-Pharazôn prepared a great force, and in SA 3261 landed the Numenorian fleet at Umbar. Ar-Pharazôn's army marched from Umbar to Mordor, forcing Sauron to humble himself before him, as he could not match the splendor and might of Numenor. While Numenor would be the uncontested dominant power in Middle-earth, her downfall would not come at the hands of an enemy's military, but rather deception. Sauron would become the chief advisor to Ar-Pharazôn, managing to deceive the king of Numenor, convincing him to breach the ban of the Valar and sail for Valinor. In SA 3310, King Ar-Pharazôn built the Great Armament over the course of 9 years, with his flagship being Alcarondas, the Castle of the Sea. The Numenorian fleet was so numerous it compared to an archipelago of 1,000 islands surrounding Tol Eressëa on its way to Aman. King Ar-Pharazôn's fleet landed in Aman, with his host making their camp at Tuna. Manwë then called upon Ilúvatar, who opened a massive chasm in the sea between Numenor and Aman, swallowing the ships in the Great Armament. Ar-Pharazôn, along with his host, were buried under falling hills and would remain in the Caves of the Forgotten until the last battle. For all of their splendor and might, the faithless Numenorians were outwitted by Sauron and delivered to calamity at the hands of Ilúvatar. Yet while Numenor perished beneath the sea, with a large portion of her grand navy and enormous hosts of her population, the faithful Dunedain would survive. Their ancestors fled east for Middle-earth, forming the realms in exile that would usher in the defeat of Sauron, at least for a while. More videos on the societies of Middle-earth are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we will catch you on the next one.